Amsterdam. Autumn, 1636. A thin rain fell over the canals that cut through the city. Inside a packed coffee house, a blacksmith had just signed a contract to buy something he had never touched, never seen grow, and didn't even hold in his hands yet. He had just traded his life savings for a promise of a single flower. Pause, cut to images of tulips in bloom, their colors blazing like fire against a dark canvas. Not gold, not land, not a merchant ship laden with spices from the East Indies. A single flower, one that within a few months would be worth more than a house on the finest canal in the city. This wasn't the madness of a handful of people. It was a fever that gripped an entire nation, from noblemen to washerwomen, from wealthy merchants to pig farmers. And when that fever finally broke, it would leave scars we're still talking about nearly 4 centuries later. This is a story about greed, about beauty turned into a financial weapon, and about the first recorded economic bubble in human history. Welcome to the story of Tulip Mania. To understand how a single flower could ruin people's lives, we have to travel back long before Amsterdam, to the windswept steppes of Central Asia, where wild tulips first bloomed among the rocky slopes of the Tian Shan Mountains. Centuries before Europeans ever laid eyes on them, tulips were already a symbol of majesty within the Ottoman Empire, prized in the gardens of sultans and woven into the visual language of power itself. The very name tulip is said to come from the Turkish word for turban. So closely did the shape of its petals resemble the headwear of Ottoman noblemen. Then, in the mid-16th century, an Austrian diplomat named Ogier de Busbecq caught sight of this strange, striking flower growing in the gardens of Istanbul. He was captivated. Unable to leave it behind, he sent seeds and bulbs home to Europe. And it was there, quietly, almost accidentally, that this story truly began. The tulip landed on soil that by sheer coincidence was perfect for it. The sandy, well-drained earth of the Netherlands turned out to be ideally suited to bulb cultivation, and a botanist named Carolus Clusius, working at the University of Leiden, began growing and studying this exotic newcomer with real scientific rigor. Clusius was a true man of science. He wanted to understand the tulip, not profit from it, and he even refused to share his bulbs with people who saw in them nothing more than a chance to get rich. But greed has a way of finding its own way in. One night, Clusius's garden was broken into. His tulip bulbs were stolen and scattered across the Netherlands, passing from hand to hand into a country hungry for something new to desire. And without ever meaning to, the quiet botanist who only wanted to study a flower had just lit the fuse on one of the greatest financial explosions in human history. Picture the Netherlands in the 1620s. This young republic stood at the very peak of its power. Ships belonging to the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the VOC, the largest trading company the world had ever seen, sailed home laden with spices, silk, and porcelain from the far corners of the globe. Money poured into cities like Amsterdam and Haarlem at a staggering rate, and with it came a new class of merchants and traders who had grown wealthy almost overnight. But wealth, once acquired, demands to be displayed. The newly rich needed something to signal their status, something rare and beautiful enough to set them apart from the crowd. And it was the tulip that stepped forward to fill that role. Not just any tulip, though. What captured the imagination of Dutch high society were the rare varieties whose petals were streaked with flame-like patterns, a striking effect caused by something no one at the time understood, a plant virus that made the color in the petals break into extraordinary, unpredictable designs. Varieties like the legendary Semper Augustus became instant symbols of status and refinement. A single bulb of this variety alone could fetch a price equal to one of the most luxurious canal-side houses in Amsterdam. An almost absurd exchange of a tiny, fragile object for a monument of brick and stone. Owning such a bulb wasn't just an investment. It was a declaration, a way of announcing to the world that you had arrived. And it was here that the market began to shift into something far stranger. At first, tulips were traded like any ordinary commodity, physical bulbs changing hands during the harvest season, bought and sold, much like grain or cheese. But demand grew far faster than growers could possibly cultivate new bulbs, and so traders invented something entirely new: futures contracts. Instead of selling a bulb that already existed, they began selling a promise, the right to purchase a bulb that was still buried in the ground, not yet grown, not yet even dug up. This new form of trading became known as the wind handle market, literally the trade of wind. Because, quite literally, what was being bought and sold was no longer a flower at all. It was air, an empty promise scrawled on a piece of paper, changing hands again and again, each time for a little more than the last. The winter of 1636 marked the moment this madness tipped over into full-blown hysteria. Coffee houses across the Netherlands filled with informal tulip traders, ordinary people who owned no land, no gardens, no bulbs of any kind, yet who bought and sold bulb contracts as casually as if they were shares of stock. A baker might find himself seated beside a nobleman, the two of them equals for a moment, both placing bets on what next spring's bulb prices would be. Rank and profession stopped mattering. All that mattered was whether you were in the game or watching from the outside, and fewer people wanted to be left watching. Prices no longer followed any ordinary economic logic. They followed the logic of the crowd. Everyone bought because they were certain someone else would be willing to pay even more the next day. This is what economists would later come to call the greater fool theory. You don't need to believe something has real, intrinsic value. You only need to believe that there will always be someone else, a greater fool than yourself, willing to pay more for it than you just did. As long as that belief held, the cycle could feed itself endlessly, each new buyer justifying the last one's price and setting an even higher bar for the next. Legendary stories from this era have survived, some likely exaggerated by history's retelling, but all capturing the spirit of the madness that gripped the age. There are accounts of a single, rare tulip bulb traded for an entire fully furnished house. There's the tale of a sailor who, not knowing any better, ate a merchant's prized tulip bulb, mistaking it for an ordinary onion, and ended up thrown in jail for unknowingly destroying wealth equal to a full year's wages for an entire ship's crew. Whether every detail of these stories holds up to scrutiny or not, the spirit of the era they reveal is unmistakable. Common sense had drowned completely in a wave of collective euphoria, and almost no one left standing could see it happening to them. Every bubble reaches a point where gravity finally wins. For tulips, that point arrived during an entirely ordinary auction in the city of Haarlem in early February of 1637. For the first time in years, no one wanted to buy. No one knows exactly why. Perhaps the plague sweeping through Haarlem at the time kept buyers away from the auction hall. Perhaps a single major trader had quietly begun offloading his holdings, spooking others without anyone quite realizing it. But whatever the spark, once doubt crept in, once a single auction failed to sell, the confidence holding up the entire market collapsed within a matter of days. It was as if everyone had been asking the same silent question all along: waiting for permission to stop believing, and that one empty auction gave it to them. Prices that had climbed relentlessly for months now fell into free fall. Contracts that had been worth the price of a house the day before couldn't fetch the price of a basket of onions by the next. Thousands of people who had signed purchase contracts at the peak of the market now found themselves legally bound to pay prices that had become meaningless overnight. Local courts were flooded with disputes as buyers and sellers turned on one another, each side insisting the other on terms that no longer made any sense. Eventually, the Dutch government stepped in, ruling that tulip contracts could be settled by paying only a small fraction, roughly 3.5%, of their original agreed value. For many historians, this is precisely what spared the Netherlands from total economic catastrophe. As dramatic as the frenzy had been inside the coffee houses, the bubble ultimately touched only a narrow slice of society, while the real backbone of Dutch wealth, its trading ships, its warehouses stacked with spices, its vast commercial empire, remained largely untouched and intact. Tulip Mania is often called the first recorded financial bubble in human history, but its legacy stretches far beyond a mere footnote in 17th-century Dutch history, echoing forward through nearly 4 centuries of human behavior that, it turns out, never really changed all that much. Every time an asset's value rockets far beyond any rational explanation. .com stocks in the late 1990s, cryptocurrency in 2017, and again in 2021, NFTs selling for millions of dollars for nothing more than a JPEG image. The tulip's name resurfaces as a warning. Let's not let this become the next Tulip Mania, people say. A phrase born out of the chaos of Amsterdam's coffee houses 400 years ago, and one we still reach for today, almost instinctively, whenever we sense the same fever building again. And yet, ironically, the tulip itself survived its own collapse. Unlike so many other bubbles throughout history, it didn't simply vanish once the frenzy died down. Instead, it became woven into Dutch national identity. Vast, colorful tulip fields are now among the country's biggest tourist attractions, and the Netherlands remains the largest flower exporter in the world to this very day. So perhaps the real lesson of Tulip Mania was never that the tulip itself had no worth. Perhaps it's that human beings, once swept up in collective euphoria, will always struggle to tell the difference between what something is actually worth and the price they're willing to pay for it in the heat of the moment. And as long as people can still dream of getting rich overnight, there will always be another bubble, somewhere, quietly waiting to be blown.